Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to be talking to you about one of my favorite new Power Platform features. This feature has gone into a general availability towards the end of April last year, but since then has been getting a lot of enhancements. This feature is called Power Platform Virtual Network Support. It not only unlocks new integration capabilities for you, but it also improves your security and compliance. So stay tuned to find out a bit more about it and also how you'll be able to leverage it in Copilot Studio very soon. Before I jump into today's topic, my name is Wael Hamzi and I'm a Microsoft Business Applications MVP. In this channel, I like to share with you some of the things that I have learned and continue to learn having worked over 20 years on Microsoft Business Applications. Here are some of the channels where I share content. You are more welcome to connect with me. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel if you find this content to be helpful. Let's talk around some prerequisite knowledge that you will need before we start talking about virtual network support. So virtual network support is a feature that allows you to control outbound connectivity from Power Platform. So by outbound, I mean connections that are initiated from the Power Platform components running in the Microsoft Cloud. And by control, I mean you get to decide which connections you want to allow and which ones you want to deny. So the current features that are supported by virtual network support are, so one is plugins. In case you haven't come across plugins, plugins are pieces of code typically written in C# that you deploy into your Power Platform environment. You can register plugins to run on specific events. For example, you can create a plugin that runs every time a contact record is created. The code in the plugin can then connect to an external API to perform further logic or integrations. The other feature that is supported by virtual networks are connectors. You can use connectors to connect from Power Apps and Power Automate to external systems such as SQL Server. The purpose of today's video is to make you aware of virtual network support so you can decide if this is something you should invest further effort in. I will start to talk about the default state, which is basically where you stand if you take no further action today. Then I will show you how things will look like if you configure virtual network support. I will then move on to talk about the benefits of virtual network support. Next, I will talk you through the prerequisites and the setup process at a high level. Then I will talk about the main considerations you need to know about before you go ahead with the implementation. And finally, we will look at some of the upcoming enhancements. So let's take a look at how plugins behave without virtual network support. So first you have the Microsoft Cloud. Within the Microsoft Cloud, you typically have your Power Platform environments. Within your Power Platform environments, you would have plugins that run on certain events. Now, these plugins may want to connect to external resources to perform certain additional logic. So in terms of external resources, you would typically have the internet. So the internet consists of approved services, which is things you're happy to connect into. So as an example is any Azure resources that you have that have public endpoints. So these ones would be the resources that you're happy to expose them as public endpoints. And then you may have some other public services that you have. Also, you may have some third parties that you want to connect into. And then you have the unapproved services, which is the services that ideally you don't want anyone in your organization connecting into. So because the plugins currently run in the Microsoft Cloud, you're able to establish a connection to all of these approved services that you have and you want to connect into. But at the same time, you also are able to establish a connection to some of the unauthorized or unapproved services that you probably don't want developers in your organizations connecting into. And then we have our private resources within Azure. So you probably have an Azure tenant. You have some resources in there like Azure Functions, and these are or SQL Server, and these are behind private endpoints because they have perhaps sensitive data you don't want to expose to the internet. So in the current situation, your plugins won't be able to reach to your private resources because there is no direct network connectivity between the plugin that is running within the Microsoft Cloud and your private resources. In addition to that, you've got on-premises as well. So on-premises is basically all your kind of services that are running within your data center and your internal network. So you would have probably a number of internal resources in there that you may want to integrate with. And you also may have express route that connects your virtual network in Azure to your internal network using peering. So in the current situation, if your plugin was to integrate with these internal resources, it can't, again, because it doesn't have that line of sight between the cloud and your on-premises. Now let's take a look how this picture is different when we configure virtual network support. So this is what we had previously. So we got our approved services, unapproved services, our private resources within Azure, and also our internal resources within our internal network. So when we configure virtual network support, we are basically linking the execution of plugins or the Power Platform environment with our virtual network within Azure using Subnet delegation. So instead of the plugin running in the Microsoft Cloud, now you have a container within your virtual network that will execute that plugin. So the plugin will execute in the context of your virtual network. So it is as if the plugin was running within your virtual network. And that makes a big difference because now your virtual network decides on how that plugin can communicate with the outside world. So using things like proxies, firewalls, gateways, you get a chance to decide in terms of what you want to allow and what you want to deny. So as an example, you may whitelist all your approved services on your kind of network boundaries, but you can also deny all the other services that you don't want your Power Platform environments communicating into. So that is one advantage. The other one is you get the ability to communicate with your private resources within your virtual network or other virtual networks that you have in Azure that you've connected together. So now you've got that ability to leverage these private resources within Azure, whether that is your Azure Functions or SQL Server. And finally, if you've got express route connectivity, because your now virtual network in Azure is connected to your internal network, your plugins again now can communicate with these on-premises APIs and databases and whatever you may want to, leverage from your, backend systems. So as you can see, with virtual network support, we've been able to still allow the connections that were previously wanted to allow, but now we can deny the connections that we don't want to allow. And now we've also got the ability to integrate with other resources that otherwise we would have to make them public, which is not desirable in many cases, but now we can still connect to them while they're behind private endpoints and also remain within our internal network. Now let's talk about how connectors behave without virtual network support. So this is the same picture that we had before, but instead of plugins, we now have connectors in the Power Platform environment. So the first thing that you may notice is that around the Power Platform environment, now we had a dotted red box. And that what that means is that connectors are subject to something called the data policies or the DLP. So if you configure a data policy for a specific environment, you get the ability to decide what connectors you want to allow in that environment, and also in some cases, what endpoints and what actions you want to allow on these connectors. So using data policies, you can control outbound connectivity from that Power Platform environment for connectors. So you can decide, to enable the connectors for your approved services, but also deny the connectors that would enable you to connect into your unapproved or unauthorized services. So, but if you want to establish connectivity with the private resources that you have within your Azure environment, your virtual network, or your internal resources, you'd have to configure something called the on-premises data gateway. So what the on-premises data gateway does is basically you install it on a virtual machine within your virtual network, and then you install the data gateway software, and that software then establishes connectivity with your Power Platform environment. So every time you want to use a connector that's supported by the on-premises data gateway within your app or flow, then that connectivity can be routed using that on-premises data gateway. So as an example, if you enable the HTTP connector on that environment and you routed that traffic using on-premises data gateway, you can still use your Azure network perimeter controls to decide on where that HTTP connection goes into when you're running within your on-premises data gateway. So you could whitelist the URLs that would allow you to connect into your approved services, but also deny the URLs that would enable somebody to connect into your unauthorized services. But now, because the HTTP connector is running within the data gateway, as an example, you would be able to establish connectivity into your, for example, private function app. But also, if you had an internal API that was accessible using the HTTP protocol and you had express route using the on-premises data gateway, you were also now able to establish that connectivity. So as you can see, with the combination of DLP and the on-premises data gateway, you are able to establish connectivity and control connectivity from your Power Platform environment. The only caveat to that is not all connectors obviously are supported, but also, configuring the on-premises data gateway, requires, setup effort and time and ongoing maintenance. The other difference I just want to highlight is that obviously plugins don't support the on-premises data gateway and don't support the DLP policies. So that's why it was a slightly different picture when we looked at plugins previously. Let's now take a look at how connectors behave with virtual network support. So again, same picture as before, but now instead of using the on-premises data gateway, we're going to link the Power Platform environment to the virtual network using Subnet delegation. So again, if we have now a Power App or a Power Automate that wants to make an outbound connection using a connector that is supported by subnet delegation like HTTP connector. So the virtual network will basically contain a container that will execute that functionality on behalf of the Power App or the Power Automate. So think about your connections now being running in the context of your virtual network. So as an example now, let's say we've enabled the HTTP connector, we've enabled subnet delegation. So if we whitelist the approved services on our firewalls and proxies, we can make the outbound connectivity to the approved services. We can equally deny the URLs or anything else that we don't want. But now we can also, using subnet delegation, we can establish that connectivity from the Power App, for example, to our private function app or SQL Server. And also, if you go express route, you can also do the same thing by connecting from your Power Apps and Power Automate using connectors into your internal network. So as you can see, you can establish probably similar things to what you would do with the on-premises data gateway, but with the added advantage that obviously you don't have to worry about VMs, you don't have to worry about installing software, you don't have to worry about regular maintenance of these. And also in some cases you may be able to see some performance improvements as well. Now let's recap some of the benefits that we've probably observed using or looking at some of the previous scenarios. So one, virtual network support allows us to integrate with private resources in Azure and on premises. Without this, you would need to make these resources publicly accessible, which may not be acceptable and secure enough for many scenarios. Two, it stops connectivity to unwanted destinations, especially in plugins. This can mitigate against risks of data leakage and exfiltration by insiders. Three, by routing the traffic through the Azure Virtual Network, you get the opportunity to utilize advanced networking capabilities such as gateway, proxies, and firewalls to give you full control, logging, and also an audit of all your outbound connections. This is currently not built into the plugin framework to give you an audit log of all the connections made. So basically, auditing is a big, plus when you have virtual network. Four is eliminating the need to route traffic over the public internet, reduces the risk of obviously traffic being intercepted and your public endpoints being exploited. And five, on-premises data gateway has proven useful to enable connectors to connect into private resources. However, this requires initial setup and ongoing management of virtual machines and network, which takes time and effort. Virtual network support can basically enable connectors to have the same connectivity with less effort and maintenance. Now let's talk about some of the prerequisites that you will need before you set up virtual network support. First, you will need to decide on which environments in your tenant you will want to enable virtual network support. One thing to note is that these should be managed environments. You will need to decide on things like whether you want to apply to developer environments or just sandbox and production environments. You will also need to decide on how many environments will require this capability and in what regions as well, as they are directly impacting the number of IPs that you will need in your subnets. Also, you will need different virtual networks for each region. Now, once you have decided on the environments, for each environment, you will need to review all the components that could be impacted by virtual network support. Things like plugins, apps, and flows, especially ones that rely on connectors. If these components connect into the same Dataverse environments, in the case of plugins, then this should be covered by default. But if these connect to external endpoints, then you will need to make sure that these endpoints are allowed by your virtual network. It is a good idea to apply virtual network support on one of your sandbox environments first, and then perform some impact assessment before considering to apply it into a production environment. Remember, you can always roll back virtual network support if things don't go as expected. Next, to set up virtual network support, you will need to be a Power Platform administrator. Note that this is mostly done via scripts, so you could automate this process behind a self-service capability. And finally, because you will need to set up some Azure resources as well, you will need an Azure subscription where you have the required permissions to create resources like virtual networks and subnets. Once you have completed all of these prerequisites, you can move on to the setup stage. Here is a high-level overview of the setup process. The first step is to create the virtual networks and subnet for all of your required regions. Make sure you allocate enough IPs, as these can't be changed once the setup is complete. The next step is to configure your virtual networks to become Power Platform resource providers. This basically means that your Azure resources will be enabled to be able to execute things like plugins and connectors. This can be done by executing a PowerShell script. Also, make sure you enable connectivity to any endpoints you require based on the previous exercise. Now, once your virtual network is set up, the next step is to create an enterprise policy that points to it. Again, this can be done by executing a PowerShell script. The last step is to link the required Power Platform environments to the enterprise policy. Remember, these must be in the same region. This step can also be done via executing a PowerShell script. Now you should be ready to go and you can perform testing to ensure everything is working as expected. Here are a few things to be aware of before you go ahead and configure virtual network support. The first main consideration is that not all features are currently supported. I expect the list of supported features to grow over time, so only a subset of connectors are currently supported. The unsupported connectors will continue to connect via the default mechanism described earlier. Low-code plugins will only be supported if the connectors used within these are supported. Azure-aware plugins and service endpoints are also currently not supported. The second main consideration is around regions. As you know, the virtual network must be in the same region as the Power Platform environment. And note that not all regions are currently supported. Also, you will need a virtual network in the same region pair. So for Europe, you will need a virtual network in North Europe and West Europe for redundancy. The third main consideration is around IP addresses. So you will need at least 251 IP addresses allocated to a subnet. And if you plan to allocate more than one environment, you will need more than these. It is important to get the number of IPs right from the start, as you can't change this once your setup is complete. So you will need to go through the whole process again. And finally, if you are connecting to an external API, these will need to have a certificate signed by a trusted CA, as custom root CAs are not currently supported. Now that you have a good understanding of virtual network support, let's take a look at some of the upcoming features. The first feature is environment variables for Azure Key Vault secrets. Today, if you want to use environment variables with secrets backed by the Azure Key Vault, the Key Vault has to be public, which is not acceptable for many organizations. With this enhancement, you will be able to utilize secrets stored in your private key vaults. The second enhancement is around service endpoints in Dataverse. So similar to the situation with connecting to the Azure Service Bus, your Service Bus endpoints will need to be public so you are able to publish a message into them. And with this enhancement, you'll be able to publish into your Azure Service Bus, which is behind a private endpoint. The third enhancement is around Copilot Studio. So Copilot Studio will also support virtual network support. This will enable Copilot Studio to leverage your private resources and also push telemetry into your private application insights in Azure. Next, 12 additional connectors will be available. So you'll be able to integrate with things like the Azure OpenAI and Azure Data Factory and lots of other connectors with these enhancements. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, that you will need to make sure that you have enough IP addresses for the right number of environments that are linked to your subnets. With this upcoming feature, you'll be able to basically keep an eye on your used and available IP addresses so you can, make any adjustments before things go wrong. So many of these features will be available in public preview for March 2025 and are likely to go into GA on May 2025. So stay tuned for these upcoming enhancements and probably more things in the future as well. Hopefully, this video gave you a good understanding and overview of virtual network support. If you want to find out more information or step-by-step instructions in terms of how to set it up, there is lots of documentation on Microsoft Learn under the Power Platform Administration Guide. So for example, you can see a list of supported regions that I described earlier. So for example, if you have an environment in Europe, you will need to set up a virtual network in West Europe and North Europe. You can also see the list of currently supported connectors, and this list will obviously change over time. And there's also a step-by-step guide that you can follow to basically set up your virtual network utilizing some of the scripts that are available on GitHub. Thank you for watching. Hit the like button if you found this video useful and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future content. Have a good day.